I was kicked out of a meeting by a junior employee for being just a secretary. Then they found out. The boardroom was colder than usual, though the air conditioning hadn't been touched. Hannah sat quietly in the corner, her notepad open, a pen neatly clipped to the top. She'd been called in by the CEO's assistant to sit in on the strategy session for the upcoming merger. She wasn't entirely sure why. As the executive secretary, she was often asked to take minutes or provide support material, but something about the tone of the email felt different. When she entered, the room was already half full with executives, new faces, most of them young, sharply dressed, exuding ambition. Hannah kept her eyes down, unobtrusive. That was how she'd survived 16 years in this building. As the room filled, a tall man in a gray suit entered, scanning the room before his eyes locked on her. Adrian Cortez. He had joined the company 3 months ago and had quickly climbed into a leadership position in business development. "Excuse me," he said loudly, catching the attention of the others. "This meeting is for decision makers. Assistants aren't needed here." The silence that followed cut deeper than his words. A few people shifted awkwardly. One even chuckled. Hannah stood, holding her notepad tightly. She nodded politely, despite the heat rising to her face, and left the room without another word. The elevator doors closed behind her, and she leaned against the wall, her heart pounding, not from embarrassment, but from something older. Something deeper. Back in her office, Hannah sat down at her desk, her hands trembling slightly. She stared blankly at the computer screen as her thoughts replayed the moment again and again. It wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed, ignored, or assumed to be less than she was. Over the years, many had looked at her and seen only the quiet woman in the back of the room who arranged schedules and managed paperwork. But none had done it so loudly, so intentionally, in front of so many people. She had taken notes in more board meetings than most of those executives had attended in their entire careers. She had known 4 CEOs, countless department heads, and every client who mattered. Despite it all, Hannah never sought the spotlight. She found power in listening, in knowing everything while saying very little. That's what had always made her invaluable. But it also made her invisible. After Adrian's insult, she sat back in her chair and allowed herself a quiet moment of grief. Not just for the humiliation, but for all the years of being seen and yet unseen. She remembered the birthday parties she never got invited to, the thank you notes she never received, the moments where she had kept projects afloat in silence. She had never asked for credit. But perhaps that had been a mistake. Maybe the time for silence had passed. Hannah began working at Weston and Gray when she was just 25. Back then, the office was smaller, the walls still pale beige from the 90s, and the phones rang constantly. She had come in with a community college degree in business admin and a dream of climbing the ladder. But over time, that dream shifted. Life had other plans. Her father fell ill 2 years into her career, and her mother needed help at home. Promotions and evening MBA classes were replaced with hospital visits and grocery runs. And so, she stayed where she was, working hard, staying late, always reliable, always overlooked. Her reliability became a silent curse. She did her job so well that no one ever questioned it, never wondered if she might do more. The company grew, new buildings were added, departments expanded, and her desk moved from the main floor to a small glass room off the executive suite. They called it the command center, jokingly. But Hannah made it work. She remembered birthdays, managed crises before they escalated, reminded overworked VPs of meetings they'd forgotten, and solved client mix-ups before they even reached the legal team. Her job description never changed, but her responsibilities multiplied. And yet, when new hires came in, they never asked her name. She was always the secretary, the woman who took care of things, but never mattered enough to know. It was a bitter kind of irony, how often she was the one who ensured others' success. There were executives who would have crashed and burned in their first quarter if not for her quiet interventions. Once, she stayed until midnight drafting an entire quarterly update after a department head realized his team hadn't delivered the report. She never got credit, of course, but the presentation went flawlessly, and he was promoted 2 weeks later. Another time, a client crisis was narrowly avoided because she noticed a contract clause nobody else had flagged. The senior VP got the glory, Hannah got a quiet thank you in passing. But what hurt most wasn't the lack of recognition. It was how quickly they forgot. One manager used to bring her coffee every Friday in gratitude until his promotion. After that, he wouldn't even hold the elevator door. Another intern she mentored went on to become director of finance. She ran into him in the lobby once, and he walked past her without a word. She smiled anyway. It was her nature. Still, the weight of being everyone's silent support had begun to wear her down. Especially now, watching people like Adrian, who had been with the company for mere months, look at her as if she didn't belong in the same room. There were times Hannah wondered what might have been if she had spoken up more. She remembered once being invited to share feedback in a town hall meeting. She had written 3 pages of thoughtful suggestions. But when the microphone was passed to her, and all eyes turned her way, she smiled and said, "Nothing to add." She regretted that moment for years. Not because she feared speaking in public, she didn't, but because something inside her had convinced her that her words wouldn't matter. That she was only important as long as she remained quiet, composed, and agreeable. The irony was that many executives came to her for advice, off the record, of course. "Hannah, do you think the board will like this pitch? Can you review this email before I send it to the partners?" They trusted her instincts but never respected her title. Over time, it chipped away at her identity. She began to blend into the wallpaper, her competence taken for granted. But in that boardroom, when Adrian publicly humiliated her, something snapped. It wasn't just the insult. It was the culmination of years of being pushed into a corner. She had accepted invisibility because it kept the peace. But now she wondered, was it time to be seen? In the months leading up to that humiliating meeting, the company had undergone a massive leadership transition. The founder had quietly retired due to health issues, and a younger generation was taking over. Adrian Cortez, along with several new recruits, came in through an aggressive headhunting initiative designed to modernize Weston and Gray. With buzzwords like innovation and digital pivot, the new executives arrived dressed for war, eager to make their mark. In their zeal to revolutionize everything, they began dismantling structures they didn't understand, including the very systems Hannah had spent years building behind the scenes. Departments that once collaborated closely grew fractured under the weight of new policies. Veteran employees were let go or reassigned. The new leadership, led unofficially by Adrian, saw tenure as a liability. Even the CEO, a man Hannah had worked beside for over a decade, was slowly edged out of decision-making. He grew quiet, retreating into his office more each day. In private, he confided in Hannah that he was tired and unsure whether the company was still his. Watching the slow erosion of what they had built together, Hannah said little. But she remembered everything, every change, every name, every meeting that left her feeling less human. Adrian Cortez was everything a headline executive should be: young, Ivy League educated, fluent in data speak, and ruthlessly ambitious. He wasn't the type to ask questions before issuing orders. To him, respect was something you earned only through visible authority, not quiet competence. The first time he saw Hannah, he didn't even introduce himself. He handed her a folder and said, "Make this look presentable for Monday." She obliged, though the request came after hours on a Friday. The following week, he claimed the final draft as his own and didn't bother thanking her. It was a pattern that only worsened with time. Adrian held weekly meetings where he evaluated department heads like a teacher grading children. He cut budgets mercilessly and reshuffled teams based on metrics no one fully understood. People whispered about his arrogance, but few dared oppose him. His charm and confidence seemed to blind upper management, while his cold efficiency made middle managers too fearful to resist. Hannah watched all of this from her office, filing documents, scheduling meetings, coordinating travel. Adrian treated her like office furniture, present, necessary, but ultimately beneath notice. Until the day he humiliated her, Hannah had managed to stay out of his path. But now, he had made her his target. And unknowingly, he'd also made himself hers. The meeting that morning was supposed to finalize a partnership with an international firm. Adrian was leading the presentation, but Hannah had spent the last 3 weeks assembling the financial packets, adjusting language in the contracts, and coordinating time zones for 5 executives across 3 countries. She wasn't just a secretary in that moment, she was the architect behind the logistics that made the meeting even possible. And yet, when she stepped into the room to deliver final copies and confirm one last scheduled detail, Adrian looked at her as if she had walked into his house uninvited. "This meeting is not for support staff," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Get her out of here." His words struck like a slap. Around the table, no one spoke. No one intervened. Even those who knew her well, who had worked with her for years, lowered their eyes. Hannah hesitated for a heartbeat, just one, but then turned on her heel and walked out. In the hallway, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she walked to her office, shut the door, and sat at her desk. A quiet rage settled in her bones. This wasn't about the insult. It was about the years of disrespect, now finally spoken aloud. Something inside her clicked. The silence that had once protected her was now a prison. And she was ready to step out. When Hannah entered the elevator, it was empty. The mirrored walls reflected her composed expression, but her hands betrayed her, trembling, clenched tightly into fists. As the doors closed, a lump rose in her throat. She pressed the emergency stop, just for a moment, and let her back slide down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. That's when the tears came. Not loud sobs, but quiet, bitter tears, the kind that come from being unseen for too long. She thought of the old CEO, of the days when her work had been trusted even if uncelebrated. Now, those days felt like a distant dream. She wiped her face with a tissue from her purse and took a deep breath. Her phone buzzed, a calendar notification reminding her of another executive's flight booking. Business as usual. She stood, fixed her hair, restarted the elevator, and exited as though nothing had happened. No one would know she had cried. That was her strength. But this time, she wasn't going to bury the feeling. This time, she would use it. As she returned to her desk, her eyes landed on something tucked deep in the corner of her drawer, a sealed envelope with a heavy wax seal. She hadn't touched it in years. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She opened the drawer and pulled it out, her heartbeat quickening. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and slightly faded from time. Embossed in gold was the signature of Gregory Weston, the original founder of the company and the man who had once told Hannah, "There's more strength in quiet loyalty than in loud ambition." Inside the envelope was a single document, an agreement signed 8 years ago, naming her as a proxy for his voting shares, should anything happen to him or should he step down. It was written in formal, airtight legal language, but the intent was clear. In recognition of her contributions to the foundation and ongoing success of Weston and Gray, it read. Hannah had received it after helping Gregory through a personal crisis that nearly derailed a major acquisition. He had trusted no one else. But she had never used the document. Never even mentioned it. She believed that her place wasn't in ownership, but in stewardship. That belief had held true for years. Until now. Holding the letter in her hands, she realized that perhaps Gregory had seen something in her that she had been too modest, or too tired, to claim. And now, as Adrian stripped the company of its dignity, she knew it was time. Time to stop surviving in silence. Time to be heard. Time to remind them who she really was. Years ago, Gregory Weston had called Hannah into his office late one evening. He looked tired, his tie undone, and a half-finished scotch on the table. He confided in her about a betrayal within the executive team. One of his oldest friends was leaking information to a competitor. It had shaken him deeply. Hannah didn't ask questions. She stayed silent, listened, and later that night sifted through years of calendar notes, internal memos, and travel logs. Within hours, she found the discrepancy. Quietly, without fanfare, she handed Gregory the evidence. He never forgot it. That night, something between them shifted from employee to trusted ally. In the weeks that followed, Gregory began looping her in discreetly on more critical operations. She sat in on merger meetings, took notes not for records, but for strategic insight. She reviewed communications with clients and vendors that could make or break a deal. He saw her not as support staff, but as an extension of his judgment. One morning, after a particularly intense board discussion, he handed her the sealed envelope. "If anything ever happens to me, or if I'm forced out," he said quietly, "you'll know what to do." Hannah had tucked the envelope away, too respectful to ever imagine using it. But now, it wasn't about ambition. It was about saving the soul of the company. The document was still valid. Hannah confirmed it with a call to Gregory's personal attorney, someone she hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. When she introduced herself, he paused for a moment and said, "He told me you'd call one day." There was no need for explanation. Within 48 hours, the attorney arranged a formal review of Gregory's proxy agreement. As the legal team combed through the paperwork, Hannah stayed late, working quietly in her office, assembling supporting materials, emails, old memos, policy drafts she had co-authored anonymously, and internal communications she had preserved without knowing why. Each piece of paper became a step toward reclaiming her voice. The agreement granted her temporary control over Gregory's voting shares, enough to call for an emergency meeting of the board if necessary. What struck her most, though, was a handwritten note tucked in the file. "You see the whole board when the others only see their seats. Don't be afraid to take yours." Tears stung her eyes. Not because she was emotional, but because she finally understood. Gregory hadn't given her a gift, he had given her permission. And she was ready to use it. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and tense shoulders in the executive suite. Adrian had called for a company-wide announcement at noon, hinting at a major shift in leadership structure. Rumors swirled like wine down the halls, some whispered layoffs, others suspected a merger. Hannah arrived precisely at 8:30, dressed in a dark navy suit she hadn't worn in years, hair pulled into a sleek bun. No clipboard. No messenger bag. Just a slim black folder in her hand and calm certainty in her walk. People noticed, but no one spoke. The silence followed her all the way to the boardroom. Inside, she waited. When Adrian entered, flanked by the new HR director and his executive assistant, he blinked in surprise. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said with a forced smirk. Hannah stood slowly and handed him the folder. "This is a copy of the legacy proxy agreement signed by Gregory Weston. As of this morning, I've assumed his voting rights." Adrian's smirk froze. For a moment, the room felt suspended in air. He took the folder, flipped through the documents, and his expression darkened. "This can't be real." Hannah didn't respond. She didn't need to. The attorney had already sent the originals to the board. Word traveled faster than emails. By lunchtime, nearly every department head knew something had shifted. Adrian canceled the company-wide announcement without explanation. He tried to hold a private meeting with the CFO and legal counsel, but both declined, citing a conflict. Hannah had already scheduled a board-level review of Adrian's initiatives. In less than 24 hours, the man who had publicly dismissed her was now fighting to justify his own position. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Employees began watching Hannah with new eyes. She wasn't just the woman behind the calendar anymore. Still, Hannah didn't celebrate. She reviewed documents, made calls, and listened carefully. She wasn't here to destroy Adrian. She was here to protect what Weston and Gray used to be. But Adrian didn't see it that way. That afternoon, he barged into her office, voice low but seething. "You think this little stunt will last?" he said. "You're just playing dress up." Hannah met his eyes for the first time in weeks. "No," she replied. "You're just realizing that I've always been in the room, you just never looked up." Then she turned back to her computer and resumed typing. The very next day, a high-profile investor from London arrived for a scheduled walkthrough of Weston and Gray's operations. This visit had been arranged weeks earlier, intended as a showcase of the new leadership under Adrian. Now, the circumstances had changed. Hannah coordinated the visit herself, briefing the investors' team on the full scope of internal restructuring. She presented clean financial summaries, strategic gaps, and legacy performance data, none of which Adrian had bothered to prepare in detail. The investor, a calm and deliberate man named Peter Langford, took quiet notes, observing not just the numbers, but the people. During the closing dinner, Peter asked Hannah about her background. She shared her journey with candor, omitting the humiliations but not the truth. "I've always worked behind the scenes," she said. "But lately, I've realized that quiet competence is only valuable when it's allowed to be seen." Peter nodded, impressed. It's rare to find someone who knows the foundation and the future at the same time. Adrian, sitting across the table, shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, it became clear that the story of Weston and Gray wasn't just about who sat at the head of the table. It was about who had kept the walls from falling. And that person was Hannah. Hannah didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority emerged in the way others leaned in when she spoke, how conversations paused when she entered a room. She never changed her tone. She didn't rehearse speeches. But something had shifted, now people listened. The legal team followed her lead. Longtime employees began stopping by her office just to check in, some thanking her quietly, others simply nodding with recognition. For the first time, her presence had weight that others acknowledged, not because she demanded it, but because it was always there, now finally visible. Her days grew long, filled with meetings she used to organize and now led. She reinstated weekly cross-department briefings and invited senior staff who'd been marginalized. She asked questions no one else dared to. What is this policy costing us in trust? Why was this manager terminated without review? Adrian, though still officially head of business development, had become a shadow. The board had limited his authority pending full review. He no longer dismissed Hannah. He avoided her entirely. 2 weeks after assuming temporary proxy control, Hannah entered a high-level meeting with key board members to present a revised corporate strategy. Adrian walked in uninvited, suit pristine, expression unreadable. As he took a seat, one of the board members, Ms. Evelyn Shaw, raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Cortez," she said coolly, "I believe this meeting is being chaired by Ms. Dalton today." Adrian scoffed and leaned forward. "With all due respect, she's not even on the executive payroll. She's a secretary." Silence fell. Without raising her voice, Hannah reached into her briefcase and placed a framed copy of Gregory Weston's handwritten note on the table. And yet, it seems the founder disagreed. Her tone was calm, unwavering. The board members looked at the document, then at Adrian. He looked away. There was no shouting, no dramatic exits. Just a shift in posture, the kind that ends careers not with an explosion, but with quiet, irreversible authority. Adrian was asked to step outside. This time, no one laughed. No one smirked. They all understood the hierarchy had just changed. After Adrian left, Hannah stood and began her presentation. Her voice was steady, her notes thorough. She laid out a plan focused on sustainability, ethical leadership, and talent retention. But more than the strategy, what struck the board was the clarity of her vision, built from years of observing what worked and what failed from behind the scenes. She described initiatives that hadn't been considered because the right voices were never heard. She advocated for systems that prioritized people, not just profit, and promised measurable results. No jargon, no flash. Just sense and substance. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a few seconds before Evelyn Shaw finally said, "That's the most coherent plan I've heard in years." Another board member nodded. "I agree. This company needs leadership rooted in experience, not just ambition." Hannah didn't smile. She simply thanked them, collected her papers, and left the room. Outside, Adrian waited. As she passed, he looked up and muttered, "You made your point." Hannah didn't stop. She didn't need to. The envelope had spoken louder than he ever could. By the following week, the board had voted to suspend Adrian pending a formal investigation into misconduct and hostile leadership practices. The announcement came with no ceremony. An email went out at 8:02 a.m., brief and clinical. But the ripple it caused across departments was anything but subtle. Employees gasped in hushed corners of the office. Some whispered finally. Others simply stared at the screen in disbelief. For many, it wasn't about Adrian. It was about the message. Someone had finally stood up. And it had been Hannah. That afternoon, her inbox filled with messages. Apologies from those who had once laughed at Adrian's jabs. Gratitude from junior staff who had felt invisible. Even department heads she'd once covered for sent quiet acknowledgments. One simply wrote, "I should have said something in that meeting. I'm sorry." Hannah read each message with a calm heart. She didn't seek validation, but she accepted the words with grace. What mattered most wasn't the apologies, it was the beginning of accountability. When offered the chance to speak at the next leadership assembly, Hannah hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want her moment to become a spectacle. After much thought, she accepted. On the day of the assembly, she stood in front of the crowd, not in the spotlight, but near a window, letting the light fall naturally over her face. She didn't begin with her story. She began with theirs. She spoke of trust lost and regained, of mistakes made quietly and corrected loudly, of people who mattered even when they weren't seen. She didn't mention Adrian's name. She didn't boast. Instead, she said, there is a difference between being in charge and being responsible. One is given. The other is earned. The room fell silent, not from shock, but from reverence. She ended with a simple thought: what makes a company strong isn't the brilliance of a few, it's the dignity of the many who hold it up every day. As the room erupted in applause, she didn't bow or wave. She simply stepped down and returned to her seat, letting the message speak for itself. Once the board granted Hannah limited executive authority during the transition period, she didn't waste time. She began conducting private interviews with team leaders, HR, and long-standing staff who had felt silenced under Adrian's reign. What she heard confirmed her concerns: backroom terminations, decisions made without consultation, and a culture of fear that had driven talent out the door. She didn't act with vengeance. Instead, she created a review panel made up of voices from across the company, from logistics to finance, giving everyone a seat at the table for the first time in years. Within a month, several policies were suspended and replaced with employee-driven initiatives. Hannah reopened the mentorship program that had been quietly dissolved. Former employees who had left under questionable circumstances were contacted and, in some cases, offered their roles back. Some returned, others declined but sent heartfelt messages of support. Hannah didn't celebrate publicly. Her reward was the gradual shift in atmosphere: smiles in the hallway, longer lunches, real conversations at the coffee machine. Trust was returning. Slowly, but surely. Among those Hannah brought back were individuals like Charles from facilities, who had been laid off after 2 decades because his department was labeled non-essential. She reinstated him not only with back pay but with a leadership role in the Workplace Safety Committee. Another was Nia, a systems analyst who had resigned quietly after being passed over for promotion multiple times. Hannah reached out, reviewed her past performance files, and offered her a senior position. Nia's voice trembled over the phone as she said, "No one ever called me back before." These weren't grand gestures, they were acts of restoration. Hannah knew the company had lost more than talent, it had lost its soul. So she rebuilt it, not with slogans or flashy press releases, but with dignity. At the next all-hands meeting, she introduced the new Employee Advisory Council. Every department would have a rotating representative, and the council would be empowered to challenge and shape policy. Hannah didn't want to be the voice of the people. She wanted the people to finally have their own. A few weeks after Adrian's departure, a reporter from a local business magazine requested an interview. He asked the expected questions about her rise, her confrontation with Adrian, and the surprise document from Gregory Weston. But at the end, he asked something no one else had. "With everything you endured, why didn't you ever leave?" Hannah paused for a long moment, then answered quietly, "Because I believed this place could be better. I stayed not because they deserved me, but because someone needed to remember what we were meant to be." She spoke of the company's early days, how Gregory treated the janitor with the same respect as the CFO, how decisions were discussed over coffee, not dictated from ivory towers. She remembered staying late because she cared, not because she was expected to. The article was published under the headline, "The Secretary Who Stayed." It went viral in professional circles. Hannah didn't read the comments. She didn't need strangers to validate her journey. What mattered was that now, others who had felt invisible saw what was possible. The board eventually began the formal process of selecting a new CEO. Many assumed Hannah would be named. But when asked, she declined. "I never wanted the spotlight," she said. "I wanted the light to reach everyone else." Instead, she recommended a collaborative leadership model, proposing a trio of co-executives representing strategy, people, and operations. The board was skeptical at first, but she presented data, success cases, and outlined how power shared could mean resilience gained. The new leadership model was adopted on a trial basis. 3 executives were appointed, 2 internal, 1 external, and Hannah remained as strategic advisor to the board. Under this new structure, policies were co-developed, and quarterly town halls were open to employee questions live, with no pre-screening. Transparency became not just a value, but a practice. And while some doubted the structure's efficiency, the first quarter saw a record increase in retention, satisfaction, and productivity. Hannah smiled from her seat at the back of the room, notebook in hand, just like always. It arrived folded in a cream envelope, addressed to Hannah's office, handwritten. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, Adrian's tone was nothing like the man who had once dismissed her in front of a full boardroom. The letter was direct but sincere. He admitted to misjudging her, to letting his ambition blind him to the wisdom and quiet power that had held the company together. He didn't beg for forgiveness, he simply asked for reflection. "I can't undo what I said," he wrote, "but I hope to learn from the silence I never respected." Hannah read it twice. She didn't cry, didn't feel vindicated, didn't toss it in anger. Instead, she folded it neatly and filed it in her drawer. Later that week, she replied with a simple note: "Forgiveness isn't weakness. But trust, once broken, is earned slowly." She wished him clarity and growth. That was all. She believed in redemption, but not without consequence. For Hannah, grace wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering with integrity. Hannah's response to Adrian wasn't shared with anyone. She didn't seek to publicize the letter or gain moral credit. Her forgiveness wasn't performative, it was a private act rooted in principle. She had spent too many years witnessing the damage caused by unchecked egos. Forgiving Adrian didn't mean she would trust him again, or welcome him back into the company. It meant she chose not to carry the burden of resentment. That was strength, quiet and measured, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. In her note, she had written, "We are shaped more by how we respond to pain than how we avoid it." And those words weren't just for him, they were for herself. The company had changed, but so had she. In choosing forgiveness, she reclaimed control of her story. Adrian had become a chapter, not the whole book. She filed the letter away in a drawer that now held more than memories, it held markers of transformation. Each item inside was a symbol of lessons learned, and of the dignity that silence, when wielded wisely, can preserve. The first time Hannah agreed to speak publicly was not to a business outlet, but to a local university class on leadership and ethics. The professor, an old acquaintance of Gregory's, had invited her after hearing about her quiet rise through the ranks. Standing at the front of the lecture hall, she looked out at young faces eager to lead. She spoke not of titles, but of responsibility. Not of strategy, but of humility. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room, she said, is the one who chooses not to speak until everyone else has. She shared stories, not just of her own journey, but of people like Charles, Nia, and others who had been forgotten and returned with stronger voices. The students asked thoughtful questions. One asked, how do you know when it's your time to speak up? Hannah smiled gently and answered, when silence no longer protects what matters. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. And for the first time, she didn't feel like someone who had stumbled into leadership, she felt like someone who had grown into it. The cultural shift at Weston and Gray didn't happen overnight, but it was steady. New policies were written in plain language. Anonymous surveys became a quarterly standard, and their results were shared transparently with action plans attached. Promotions began reflecting merit and collaboration, not volume and politics. Even the office layout changed, open forums replaced closed-door meetings, and collaborative lounges encouraged dialogue across roles. Employees felt heard. Morale rose, and with it, innovation. One particular moment stood out. A junior marketing associate, fresh out of school, raised a concern during a strategy session, something that, months earlier, would have cost her credibility. Instead, the panel listened, asked follow-up questions, and implemented her suggestion. She cried after the meeting, not from fear, but from relief. Hannah witnessed it from the back of the room and saw herself in that young woman. It reminded her why she stayed, why she fought, and why she would never allow silence to be mistaken for insignificance again. 6 months later, Hannah was invited to accept an award for ethical leadership at a national business conference. She hadn't sought it, hadn't even known she'd been nominated by several departments at Weston and Gray. As she stepped on stage, the room rose in applause. She looked out at the crowd, some familiar faces, many strangers, and thought of that meeting, the one where Adrian had humiliated her in front of a table of decision-makers. The memory still stung, but now it stood as a turning point, not a scar. In her acceptance speech, she didn't recount the pain. She focused on what followed. I wasn't empowered by a title, she said, but by the belief that dignity doesn't require permission. She spoke of second chances, of building systems that lift instead of crush, and of listening not to respond, but to understand. When she stepped off the stage, people lined up, not to praise her, but to thank her. That night, alone in her hotel room, she allowed herself to feel what she had denied for so long, pride, not in being seen, but in staying true. It was a Tuesday morning when Hannah passed the break room and overheard a sharp voice belittling someone. She paused. A young woman, new to the company, stood frozen, eyes wide, as a senior analyst scolded her for a minor mistake. The tone was harsh, the words cutting. Hannah stepped in. Calmly but firmly, she said, "That's not how we speak to people here." The room fell silent. The analyst muttered an apology and walked out. The young woman whispered a shaky thank you. Hannah offered a gentle smile and replied, "No one should be treated the way I once was." Later that day, she wrote a policy memo titled "Respect is not optional." It outlined a zero-tolerance approach to verbal intimidation and reinforced the values now woven into the company's fabric. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. About never letting the culture slide back into silence. As she sat at her desk, now nestled in a new collaborative wing named after Gregory Weston, she glanced at the framed note he had once given her. Below it, she had added her own words, "Sometimes the quietest voice is the one that changes everything."